A secret compartment is a place that is found by accident, at least that's what people like to believe. Mine wasn't. I've never told this story outside my own head, and even writing it now feels strange. If this ends up sounding like one of those unbelievable confession posts, I get it. If I were reading it, I'd probably think the same thing. But every detail happened exactly the way I remember it, and that's the problem with memories, you don't get to edit them after they've settled in. For context, my name is William. I'm in my 40s now, living a life that looks painfully ordinary from the outside. Steady job, quiet apartment, neighbors who nod politely in the hallway. Nobody would guess that years ago I crossed a line I promised myself I'd never cross. It didn't start with greed. It started with desperation mixed with curiosity, which is a far more dangerous combination than people realize. Back then, I worked part-time restoring old furniture. Antique desks, wardrobes, cabinets, pieces that had survived wars, divorces, bankruptcies, and generations of owners. Every scratch told a story. Every loose panel made me wonder what had been hidden inside decades earlier. That's how I developed a habit of searching for concealed spaces. Most of the time, there was nothing. Sometimes there were faded letters. Occasionally old coins. Once, a wedding photograph wrapped in yellowed newspaper. Then one afternoon, I found a compartment that wasn't supposed to exist. And everything that happened afterward became the worst decision of my life. The cabinet came from the estate of a man who'd lived alone for decades. His relatives weren't interested in antiques, they wanted the house emptied quickly, so everything was sold in bulk to a local dealer I occasionally worked for. My job was simple: clean the pieces, repair obvious damage, and make them presentable before resale. I had done it hundreds of times without giving much thought to who had owned them. The hidden compartment wasn't obvious. I only noticed it because one of the drawers felt heavier than it should have. After removing the back panel, I heard a dull click. A thin section of wood shifted just enough for me to slide my fingernail underneath. Inside was a narrow cavity that looked like it had been built into the cabinet from the day it was made. At first I smiled. Discoveries like that were every restorer's dream. Then I saw what was inside. It wasn't jewelry or old letters. It was something that immediately made me understand why someone had gone to such lengths to hide it and why I should have closed the compartment, pretended I'd never found it, and walked away. Inside the compartment sat a small metal cash box wrapped in faded brown cloth. It wasn't locked anymore, time had rusted the latch just enough that it opened with almost no effort. I remember telling myself I was only looking so I could report whatever I'd found to the dealer. That was the last completely honest thought I had. The box contained neatly stacked bundles of cash, old but still perfectly usable, along with several gold coins sealed in paper envelopes. There was also a handwritten notebook filled with dates, names, and numbers I didn't understand. I counted the money once, then counted it again because I couldn't believe it. It was more than I earned in a year. I looked over my shoulder even though the workshop was empty. That's when the temptation stopped being abstract. No cameras pointed at my workbench. No inventory listed the hidden compartment. As far as anyone else knew, the cabinet was just another antique waiting to be refinished. I realized something that terrified me. If I kept quiet, nobody would ever know the compartment had existed except me. And once the thought settled into my head, every decision afterward became a negotiation with my own conscience. People imagine that criminals make one dramatic decision and never look back. That wasn't how it happened for me. I spent the rest of the afternoon arguing with myself while pretending to sand cabinet doors. Every excuse sounded reasonable for about 30 seconds before another voice in my head tore it apart. I told myself the money had probably been forgotten for decades. Then I reminded myself that forgotten didn't mean abandoned. I wondered whether the dead owner's family even knew the compartment existed. If they didn't, would anyone ever claim what was inside? That question became the crack my conscience slipped through. By the time I locked up the workshop, I hadn't taken a single bill. But I had done something almost as important. I had decided not to tell anyone about the discovery. That silence became the first real step in my crime. The next morning I arrived an hour earlier than usual, using the spare key I'd been trusted with for years. I brought an empty backpack instead of my usual tool bag. I kept telling myself I was only preparing for a decision I hadn't made yet. Deep down, though, I already knew exactly why I'd come in early. Looking back, what unsettles me most isn't that I stole the money. It's how methodical I became once I'd decided to do it. I wasn't acting on impulse anymore. I was planning. I parked 2 streets away instead of outside the workshop, even though no one had ever questioned where I left my car. I wore an old pair of work gloves I'd normally reserve for stripping paint, figuring they would leave fewer fingerprints if I touched the cash box or the compartment. Before unlocking the door, I stood in the alley for nearly 5 minutes, watching to see if anyone was nearby. The neighborhood was quiet, but every passing dog walker suddenly felt like a potential witness. Inside, I resisted the urge to rush. I made coffee, turned on the radio, and arranged my tools exactly as I did every morning. If someone happened to arrive early, I wanted everything to look routine. Only then did I pull the cabinet away from the wall, remove the back panel, and expose the hidden compartment again. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it over the music. I remember thinking that if fear had a sound, this was it. The plan was simple enough that I convinced myself it couldn't fail. I would take the cash, leave the notebook and coins behind, close the compartment, finish restoring the cabinet, and act as though I'd never discovered anything unusual. In my mind, keeping only the money somehow made me less of a thief. It's amazing how creative your conscience becomes when it's trying to make the unacceptable feel reasonable. I had just slipped the bundles into my backpack when I heard the front door unlock. My stomach dropped. The dealer wasn't supposed to arrive for another 40 minutes. I shoved the empty cash box back into the compartment without wrapping it in the cloth, slid the wooden panel into place, and reached for a screwdriver just as footsteps echoed across the workshop. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. When the dealer walked in, he smiled and apologized for being early. He'd forgotten some paperwork and wanted to grab it before meeting a client. I forced myself to smile back. We stood there making ordinary conversation for nearly 10 minutes while my backpack sat less than 6 feet away, suddenly feeling heavier than anything I'd ever carried. When the dealer finally left, I didn't feel relieved. If anything, I was more nervous than before. The close call had rattled me, and all I wanted was to get the backpack into my car and disappear. I locked the workshop, walked outside as calmly as I could, and kept my eyes on the sidewalk instead of looking around like someone with something to hide. I was halfway down the block when I heard someone call my name. It was the estate executor who had arranged the sale of the furniture. We'd only met once, but he recognized me immediately. He waved me over with a friendly smile and asked how the restoration work was going. I answered as casually as I could, praying he wouldn't notice how tense I looked. Then he said something that made my pulse spike. The family found an old notebook last night, he told me. Now they're wondering if the cabinet might have another hidden compartment. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. I shrugged, forced a laugh, and said I hadn't found anything unusual. The lie came out so naturally that it frightened me almost as much as the possibility of being caught. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. Every vibration from my phone made me think someone had uncovered the truth. Every unfamiliar car outside my apartment looked like it belonged to the police. I knew enough about investigations to realize that panic can make innocent people look guilty, so I tried to keep my routine exactly the same. I went to work, joked with coworkers, stopped for coffee at the same cafe, and answered every call as though nothing had changed. Then the dealer pulled me aside. He said the family wanted the cabinet inspected one more time before it was sold. They'd become convinced there was another concealed compartment because of the notebook they'd found in the house. He rolled his eyes as he told me, calling it a waste of time, but he asked me to be present during the inspection since I knew the furniture best. I nodded without hesitation. Inside, I was unraveling. If they opened the compartment, they'd find the empty cash box. They'd know something had been there. And the list of people who had handled the cabinet since it left the house was painfully short. For the first time, escape no longer felt like the most likely outcome. The inspection took place the following afternoon. The dealer, the estate executor, one of the family members, and I gathered around the cabinet while it sat in the middle of the workshop under bright overhead lights. I had restored dozens of pieces in that room, but I'd never felt so exposed. Every scrape of a chair and every cough sounded unnaturally loud. The family member explained that the notebook they'd found contained references to the second drawer and the reserve, phrases that hadn't meant anything until they remembered the old cabinet. They weren't accusing anyone of stealing anything, at least not yet. They simply wanted to make sure nothing had been overlooked before the furniture changed hands. I stood beside the workbench holding a flashlight, pretending to be helpful while silently calculating how many seconds it would take before someone discovered the compartment. When the hidden panel finally slid open, everyone leaned forward. The empty cash box was still there. No one spoke for several long moments. Then the family member quietly whispered, "It wasn't empty when he hid it." That single sentence changed the atmosphere in the room completely. Nobody accused me outright, but I could feel the shift. A few minutes earlier we had been a group of people examining an old cabinet. Now we were standing in what felt like the center of a crime scene. The dealer picked up the empty cash box with obvious confusion, while the estate executor flipped through the notebook, comparing its entries with the compartment we'd uncovered. Questions came one after another. Who had access to the cabinet? Who moved it into the workshop? Who worked on it alone? Each answer narrowed the list. My name came up naturally because it had to. I was the one assigned to restore it, the one who spent the most time with it, and the one trusted with the workshop keys. None of that had seemed important when I slipped the money into my backpack. Standing there, it suddenly felt overwhelming. I answered every question calmly. I even helped inspect the rest of the cabinet, pointing out old repairs and explaining how the hidden mechanism worked. Outwardly, I looked cooperative. Inside, I was counting every heartbeat, wondering whether confidence would save me or simply make me look rehearsed. I made it through the inspection without anyone confronting me directly, but I wasn't celebrating. Suspicion has a way of lingering even when there's no proof, and I could sense it every time someone looked at me a little longer than usual. The family left with the notebook and the empty cash box, promising to contact the authorities to report the missing money. They weren't sure a crime had been committed, but they wanted everything documented. That evening, I drove home in silence. The backpack was gone by then. I had already hidden the cash in several different places around my apartment, convinced that separating it would somehow protect me. Instead, it made the money feel poisonous. Every envelope I tucked away was another reminder that I couldn't simply give it back without admitting what I'd done. 3 days later, I received a call from a detective. He spoke politely, almost casually, and asked if I could come in to answer a few routine questions about the cabinet. The word routine should have reassured me. Instead, it made my mouth go dry, because I knew exactly why I was being asked, and I also knew I wasn't ready to tell the truth that I spent the night before the interview rehearsing answers in my head. I wasn't planning some elaborate deception anymore. My goal had shrunk to something much simpler: don't contradict yourself, don't volunteer information, and don't let panic make you careless. I kept repeating those rules while staring at my apartment ceiling until sunrise. The detective's office wasn't intimidating the way television makes it look. There were no bright lights or aggressive interrogations. He offered me coffee, thanked me for coming in, and asked me to walk him through my normal restoration process. The conversation drifted naturally from furniture to hidden compartments, then back to the cabinet. He never raised his voice. That almost made it worse. At one point, he slid a photograph of the empty cash box across the table and asked whether I had ever seen it before. I looked at the picture for what was probably a second, though it felt much longer, and answered, no. The lie came effortlessly. But as soon as the word left my mouth, I realized something unsettling. Lying the first time had been terrifying. By now, I was getting good at it. And that frightened me more than the detective ever could. Weeks turned into months, and eventually the calls stopped. The detective contacted me once more to clarify a few details, but nothing came of it. There were no dramatic arrests, no surprise searches, no final confrontation. The investigation simply lost momentum. Without witnesses, fingerprints inside the hidden compartment, or any record proving exactly how much had been stored there, the case slowly faded into the background. From the outside, it looked like I had gotten away with it. That should have felt like a victory. Instead, it became its own kind of punishment. I couldn't spend the money without wondering who might notice. Large purchases felt reckless, but leaving the cash untouched made it seem like evidence waiting to be discovered. I ended up using small amounts over several years, always paying in cash, always checking over my shoulder afterward. Every transaction carried the same quiet fear. The strangest part was how the experience changed me. Before that cabinet, I thought of myself as an honest man who had made a few mistakes in life. Afterward, I stopped thinking in those terms. I had crossed a line once. Knowing I was capable of it changed the way I saw myself forever. People assume guilt is loud. They imagine sleepless nights, dramatic confessions, or a conscience that won't stop screaming. Mine wasn't like that. It was quieter, almost ordinary, which somehow made it harder to escape. It showed up in small moments. A customer thanking me for my honesty, a friend asking me to watch his house while he was away, someone calling me the most trustworthy guy they knew. Every compliment felt like it belonged to someone else. Years later, I visited an antique fair and saw a cabinet almost identical to the one that had changed my life. For a split second, I caught myself wondering whether it had a hidden compartment too. That thought hit me harder than any police interview ever had. I realized the crime hadn't only taken money that wasn't mine. It had altered the way my mind worked. Curiosity no longer felt innocent. Opportunity no longer looked harmless. Every locked drawer, every loose panel, every forgotten envelope reminded me how easily a decent person can justify one terrible decision if the circumstances seem right enough. That realization has followed me far longer than the stolen cash ever did. I've never told this story because I expected sympathy. If anything, I expect the opposite. I made a choice that wasn't mine to make, and although I avoided the legal consequences, I never escaped the personal ones. People like to say everyone has a price. I used to disagree. Now I think everyone has a moment, a single moment where one decision quietly reshapes the rest of their life. If you ever find yourself holding someone else's secret, someone's forgotten property, or an opportunity that seems impossible to trace, don't mistake the absence of witnesses for permission. The hardest person to outrun is the version of yourself that remembers exactly what happened. I still restore old furniture from time to time. Every hidden drawer I discover now gets documented immediately, photographed, and opened with someone else in the room. That's not because I'm afraid of another investigation. It's because I no longer trust the man I was back then. Maybe that's the real punishment. The money disappeared years ago, spent a little at a time. The memory didn't. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: some secret compartments stay hidden in wood, but the ones you build inside yourself are the hardest to ever close.